Good evening and happy Friday to you. Thank you so much for joining us for our fourth and final for this week. Legal analysis and debrief from what has been a truly eventful day and week in our state capitol. I want to introduce our panelists for tonight. Two names and faces that you probably know well. Both have been involved in multiple high-profile cases here in Austin and Travis County over the past few years. Adam Lowy, who has a civil practice here in Austin, and we want to welcome Rick Kofer, who is a former prosecutor and now a defense attorney here in Travis County. Thank you both for taking your time and for sharing your insights with us tonight. Adam, I just want to start with you. I mean, what a powerful day, at least in the minds of many people, this was, with the testimony of former Texas Ranger David Maxwell, who is, or who was, I should say, the head of law enforcement for Ken Paxton's AG's office. Adam, what was your impression of his testimony today?
I think powerful is the correct word. I think this is a guy who's out of a novel, such as a Robert Caro novel about Texas. He is a Texas Ranger. He's got the voice. He's got the look. And I think he is incredibly credible. I believe in what he was saying. I think that it was very notable that Ken Paxton's criminal defense attorney or impeachment attorney spent about 20 minutes praising Ranger Maxwell. Again and again, noting what a legend he is, that he's in the Texas Rangers Hall of Fame, that he's this amazing guy. Then he tried to take some shots on him. But by that point, it was clear that this is a very credible witness. So I think this was a very bad day for Ken Paxton.
Rick, how about you?
That's exactly right. Ranger Maxwell came across with tremendous authority. He owned every decision that he made in this process. And jurors, whether they're Texas senators or regular Texans, tend to put a great deal of credibility on the testimony of law enforcement witnesses. These are witnesses who generally don't have any reason to lie in the eyes of jurors. And in this instance, fair to say the lawyers, whether you're for or against Ken Paxton, people have an inherent suspicion of lawyers. Mr. Lowy and I certainly know that. But Ranger Maxwell, like Mr. Lowy said, he is straight out of central casting and was the most effective witness for the prosecution all week.
Adam, there were times when Ranger Maxwell was recounting these meetings with Nate Paul. And on the third meeting, he talks about Ken Paxton being at that meeting and becoming angry when David Maxwell was essentially saying, I'm not going to do what you're telling me to do. I'm not going to open an investigation. I know in the minds of many people watching his testimony, that was a striking moment. Do you agree that was, in fact, a striking moment that carried weight? And in your estimation, what were some of the others?
I agree with that. I think the real striking moment in my mind is that he expressly told Ken Paxton, stay away from Nate Paul, that Ranger Maxwell did his own investigation and said, look, this is not a good guy. You should not be running around with him. And subsequent events have proved to be correct about that. As we know, Nate Paul is under federal criminal indictment. There is likely more indictments coming. And so to have a ranger like Ranger Maxwell warn the attorney general, stay away from this guy, and the attorney general not only ignored that, but eventually fired him and pushed him out of the office, I think it was a very problematic day for the attorney general.
And not only stay away from him, Ranger Maxwell went as far as to say, according to his testimony today, stay away from him or you're going to get yourself indicted, which is striking because we know that Ken Paxton is and remains under federal investigation. Rick, just going inside the Ranger's testimony a little bit deeper, what similarly were some things that stood out to you?
He had a cogent reason for every decision he made. Ranger Maxwell is not a creature of politics. A lot of the witnesses that I expect that we'll hear in the future and this week may have had some political considerations. That's not the case with Ranger Maxwell. And his direction to the Attorney General came from the perspective of a career law enforcement official. When Ranger Maxwell said, if you keep running with Nate Paul, you're going to get yourself indicted, he knew what he was talking about. And there's a good reason that the federal courthouse has been abuzz, and why attorneys from Washington, D.C. and the Department of Justice have been blocking grand jury time. And it has everything to do with Ken Paxton.
Rick, I want to stay with you on this question as well. I mean, certainly Ranger Maxwell brought facts in terms of his own memory and his own impression. But I think another part, and I'm not sure if this really fits the case or not, but something that was striking as well was that day that he was terminated in November 2020. And he talked about being summoned to the office by Ken Paxton's first assistant, Brent Webster. And he didn't use this word, but it seemed like very much of a moment of indignity for him. And the way his 48-year law enforcement career ended. Did that carry any weight with the jurors, Rick?
I don't know if it carried weight with the jurors necessarily. My opinion is most of these senators, probably all of them, have decided how they will vote before they were sworn in, unfortunately. But it certainly was compelling to the audience at home. And the truth matter is this impeachment process is as much about the outcome as it is Texans seeing accountability in government. Ranger Maxwell did not leave the Attorney General's office how he should have. And he did not receive the type of recognition that is consistent with leaders in his position when they do choose to retire. Senators in particular are going to be sensitive to that. We're talking about a group of folks who rely on pomp and circumstance and formality, and they understand what it means to disregard or to treat someone worse than they should be treated.
Yeah, and Adam, I wanted to go to you with that exact question. I mean, the Texas GOP is the back the blue party in our state. How do these, especially Republican senators, reconcile, these statements from a man who is the epitome of law enforcement in Texas? I mean, for goodness sakes, he was memorialized in the Texas Ranger Museum. How do they reconcile his testimony with this idea that they want to, some of them, acquit Ken Paxton?
I think that's the real dilemma for many in the GOP that are behind Ken Paxton. It's one thing to say, look, these lawyers who are these whistleblowers are not trustworthy. We're trying to stage a mutiny, whatever the theory is. But when you
get rhinos,
when you get to a person who is a Texas Ranger, it's a big problem. And I think that you are correct. We just saw 3 years ago during the Black Lives Matter protests and riots, the GOP's response was indeed that. We backed the blue. Greg Abbott ran as governor for re-election, and that was one of his major themes. And so now you have a small part of the GOP that doesn't trust the FBI, that doesn't trust federal authorities. But I think your rank and file GOP voter reflexively will believe a law enforcement official, and I think they certainly will believe a Texas Ranger.
So, Adam, I also wanted to ask you, I mean, we see Dan Cogdell stand up, and something, it has been described as an somewhat odd, cross-examination, and you mentioned as well him sort of fluffing up his own witness, complimenting him. But did he really land any punches whatsoever with his cross-examination? And if he did, what were they?
I don't think he did. I think this is a very problematic witness for the defense. I think at the end of the day, you now have a very credible Texas Ranger saying that he felt that Ken Paxton was up to no good, was possibly committing crimes. You have other whistleblowers that are saying that. And the biggest problem in my mind is this. Where is Ken Paxton? He's not even in the Texas Senate right now. He's not showing up for his own trial. He's clearly not going to testify. And even in the past year, once this started breaking as news, we've never heard from Ken Paxton trying to explain what happened here. And I think that if you are a Texas senator, at a certain point, you have to begin to accept the validity of these allegations, because the person they are being alleged against is not even trying to refute them.
And Rick, to that end, since Adam raised this point, it has been a point all week, but isn't it common for a defendant in any sort of proceeding to sit next to their defense counsel, whisper in their ear, pass them notes, compare notes over lunch, and maybe even provide some feedback to their counsel?
It's wildly uncommon. And let me draw an analogy. I mostly practice criminal law. Adam Lowy mostly practices civil law. In a criminal case, just for a trial to proceed under the code, the defendant has to be in the courtroom. There are only very narrow circumstances in which the defendant's presence can be excused. In civil law, technically, the plaintiff or defendant does not have to be in the courtroom, but almost always they are. And I'm thinking in my head, the Alex Jones trial, which got a lot of publicity. Technically, Alex Jones didn't have to be sitting there, but he had a good reason to. For Dan Patrick to choose to not show up in proceedings that are fundamentally criminal in nature. And that was
Paxton.
Paxton, rather. Sorry. That was one of the original rulings from the lieutenant governor, is that this trial is much more akin to criminal proceedings, such that Ken Paxton is entitled to his Fifth Amendment right to not incriminate himself and to not take the stand. Now, in a civil lawsuit, the prosecution or the plaintiff could call Ken Paxton the stand and ask him question after question, and he would repeatedly have to assert his Fifth Amendment right. In a criminal case, there's no process for that. And so to me, it seems like the attorney general is trying to have his cake and eat it too, act like this is a nothing civil lawsuit in some ways, and in other ways, pretend like it's life or death. But to Adam's point, you've got 31 senators, 30 of them voting, not the attorney general's wife, and all of them have to show up every day. And at what point is there just a little bit of resentment that these people have sworn an oath that they're attempting to take their duty seriously, and here the attorney general doesn't even bother to show up?
I want to spin into next week, the second big week of this trial. We're now, by estimates that were provided at lunchtime today, about a third of the way through the time that this trial is expected to take. Adam, if you're running the House prosecution here, who do you call at 9 a.m. Monday morning, and what do you ask them? What do you want to know?
I think you continue to call the whistleblowers. I know that Blake Brickman, who is a prominent whistleblower, likely will be called next week. I think he will be a very credible witness. But at this point, I think that a lot of the evidence has already been laid out. So the real question is going to be, when the defense goes, who are they going to call? And in my mind, we already know that Ken Paxton is likely not going to testify. So I'm very curious about, is Nate Paul going to be subpoenaed to testify? Will Nate Paul show up? Remember, Nate Paul is the key to this entire case. So if you are the Paxton defense team, do you want Nate Paul showing up to explain, look, my relationship with Paxton was on the up and up. There was nothing wrong there. I was acting appropriately. That is also unlikely because, as we know, Nate Paul is under federal criminal indictment. So I'm sure his criminal defense lawyers are saying, do not step foot in that Texas Senate. So there's going to be some wild cards as to how this is going to play out. But I actually think the trial is moving faster than people thought.
Rick, who do you call at 9 a.m. Monday morning?
Monday morning, you continue with the whistleblowers. I analogize witness strategy a bit to the movie Jaws. They don't show you the shark until the end of the movie. And so I'm really interested in who will Rusty Hardin and Dick DeGuerin close with. Rusty Hardin, who I've had the opportunity to work with on occasion, brilliant trial lawyer, brilliant strategist. He's going to end with a bang. And I wonder what they may have up their sleeve. If it's not Nate Paul, and that's unlikely, right? Although we should come back to, I suspect Nate Paul's trying to cut his own deal. Is there some other employee at World Class Capital that had knowledge of these goings on that will testify? And this would be a controversial move, and it would be a risky move. But do the impeachment managers call the putative other woman in this case?
I
And
was
this
actually going to ask both of you that. Yeah. Who is she a witness for?
I mean, you'd have to think for the prosecution and not the defense. I couldn't imagine that the attorney general's spouse, that his wife, a sitting senator, would enjoy or appreciate her husband attempting to defend these acts by relying on the testimony of the other woman.
I want to own and acknowledge that this is a difficult question to be asked at this state of the game, but we are 1 week now, 4 days. The first week is now down. I just want to ask both of you. I mean, you both not only have been around the legal system, but also the political structure in our town and in our state. What happens in the end, Rick?
Mr. Lowy is both better at making predictions than I am and has more confidence, and in part because some of mine turn out to be wrong, as we've seen, and I'm sure we'll see again in the future. For certain, the Attorney General has 6 senators who are going to vote to acquit him, but that's not enough. He needs 10. He only achieved 10 votes in his favor on one motion to dismiss, which was probably the weakest of the articles of impeachment. Is it the case that there are 4 other Republican senators who will say at the conclusion of evidence that based on what they've heard, that this is bad, but it does not rise to the level of impeachment, and that they can vote to acquit on these articles? That's a pretty high bar to cross when there are as many articles of impeachment as exist. And essentially, the Attorney General has to run the field. This is much like a criminal case. If you have 10 charges and you get acquitted on 8, but you're convicted on 2, in this instance, he still gets impeached. I think the smart money is on removal, but it's Texas. Anything can happen.
And Adam, how about you?
I think that Rick Kofor is correct. It is Texas. Anything can happen. I think he's going to get removed. I think he has 6 votes in his favor that will stick with him, but he needs 4 votes on every single article of impeachment in addition to those 6. And remember, they can vote to keep him on certain articles, but on other articles, if one is voted through, he is removed. And I just don't see a scenario in which you have the majority of the Texas Senate saying he needs to be removed, the majority of the Texas House saying he needs to remove, but he somehow survives because of 1 vote. Dan Patrick does not run the Texas Senate that way. I think Dan Patrick knows how this is going to play out. He's giving him a trial, but at the end of the day, I think Dan Patrick and Greg Abbott and the power brokers in this state want to move on from this because this has been a complete sideshow for their conservative agenda.
Adam Lowy and Rick Kofor, thank you both so much for your insight. Again, both sort of in the political structure, political issues here, which loom large, let's be honest, and also obviously the legal ones as well. Look forward to talking to you again as this trial proceeds over the next couple of weeks. And again, thank you for watching and for your time, everybody. We'll be back here Monday at 6:30 sharp for another legal roundtable. Have a great weekend, everybody.
Take care.